Shalom Aleichem, and good afternoon to all of our West Coast Chaverim, and good evening to you all everywhere else. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today with the creators of this new adaptation of one of our absolute favorite works of Yiddish literature, Labzik, Meiselich wegen klugen Hintele Labzik, Tales of the Clever Pup Labzik, written by the incomparable Chaver Paver, the pen name of the great Yiddish writer Gershon Einbinder. Now, Chaver Paver's tales were originally published in 1935 by the International Workers' Order, the IWO, an organization whose Jewish People's Fraternal Order Einbinder served as director of education for, and the history and trials and tribulations of the IWO and the JPFO are deeply connected with our own organization, Yiddishkayt. And the IWO's mission remains at the heart of everything that we still do here at Yiddishkayt and who we are. And you can read much more about Chaver Paver and the Jewish People's Fraternal Order on the Yiddishkayt website. Now, Yiddishkayt was founded 25 years ago. Our founder, Aaron Paley, had created a forum to explore the multifaceted legacy of Yiddish culture in our multicultural city, Los Angeles. And our original board of directors had, by and large, a worldview that was shaped by the experience of growing up in the supplementary school network, the shulas or the shulen of the JPFO, which was the Jewish section of this International Workers' Order, and had broken away and became a flourishing left-wing alternative to the rightward drifting workmen's circle in the 1920s. And the Jewish section was the largest of 14 immigrant and ethnic sections of the IWO. And in LA, it was one of the most important and most popular Jewish organizations in the first half of the 20th century. Chaver Paver, that is Gershon Einbinder, moved to LA in 1936, where he worked for the JPFO schools, and he lived in East Hollywood. It's just about a 10-minute drive just due north of where I'm sitting right now, until the entire International Workers' Order was placed on a McCarthyite list of subversive organizations, and eventually it was forced to be liquidated in 1954. And after that, Einbinder continued writing, relying largely on the support of his community and his friends up until his death in 1964. And he's buried here in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley, just up the 5 freeway from us here, right near here. And you can find out much more about Einbinder's quarter century of work in Southern California, his writing before and after his move here, on Caroline Luce's amazing website, which we'll provide a link for in the comments. Now, after the International Workers' Order's destruction, its former members went on to form independent Jewish community centers and progressive supplementary schools here in LA and throughout the entire country. And it was that radical heritage of Yiddish-speaking educators and activists that inspired the very creation of Yiddishkayt. And as an organization, we at Yiddishkayt continue those same aims of those original IWO schools to preserve, cultivate, and broadcast the treasures of Yiddish, the diversity of its cultural legacy, and the progressive tradition of Jewish, European, and immigrant life, and to explore this cultural and moral heritage deeply. And it's a heritage that we see so clearly expressed in the work of Chaver Paver, and especially in these tales, the tales of Labzik, and eventually in the sequel, Vovik, which was written and printed here in Los Angeles, and features Labzik's adorable son, who also happens to be the namesake of our brilliant office pup. You can read about him also on our website about Vovik. And now it is my absolute pleasure to welcome 2 of the creators of the new Theater Emory adaptation of Labzik, Tales of a Clever Pup. And I hope everyone's gotten a chance to see this already. If you haven't, the production is still available for a little while on the Theater Emory site, and we'll drop a link in the comments for those of you who haven't caught it yet. But first, I'd like to welcome Jake Krakovsky. Jake is a puppeteer, educator, and multi-hyphenate theater maker, as well as a newly minted Yiddishist, soll uns Gott abheben. He is based in Atlanta, where he graduated summa cum laude in theater studies from Emory University. And among his many projects, Jake was a full-time puppeteer on Moon and Me, a BBC children's TV show from the creator of Teletubbies, which you can also catch on YouTube. And he recently completed a fellowship at the Alliance Theater to develop a new solo theater piece. Well, welcome, Jake. It's so great to see you.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here.
And now I'd also like to introduce Miriam Udel, Associate Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture at Emory University. At Emory, Miriam teaches and researches 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, American Jewish literature, and genre studies. And her new book, Honey on the Page, is just an absolutely incredible illustrated treasury of Yiddish children's stories and poems published by the NYU Press, and it's available on her website. So please check that out. And a good Abend, sei begrüßt, Miriam. It is so great to see you here today.
Thank you for arranging this homecoming for Labzik.
Oh, we're so happy to have him here. It's back united with Vavik in this very office, although Vavik's not in the office today. So while we here in the Yiddishkayt office are longtime Labzik fans, we wanted to know what drew you both to Labzik. Why don't we start with Jake, since you're a little newer to the Labzik world, and then Miriam, you can answer the same question.
Sure. Well, really, Miriam introduced me to the Labzik stories. I took a public seminar that she taught at the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, which is an organization adjacent to Emory University here, related to her research into Yiddish children's literature. And we read various samples, and I was just so taken by these stories. For one, they're just simply, beautifully written, extremely charming. Chaver Paver has a wonderful voice and an ear for dialogue, and so they're just pleasurable and enjoyable on that level. But I was particularly taken by, you don't encounter this type of children's literature for the most part these days that has a very straightforward, one could even say didactic political inclination. And I thought there is actually, as opposed to being, kind of browbeating or whatever you might imagine from something like that, I actually found a great deal of clarity in having these, what we could say are complicated moral political ideas, communicated as you would to children. I thought it was very clarifying. I thought there was some real moral urgency and directness that we often lack in grown-up conversations about this kind of stuff. And the fact that all of that was put into the interiority of this little puppy dog was just incredible to me. So I fell in love almost immediately.
How about you, Miriam? How did you come across Labzik for the first time, and what was your first reaction to discovering Labzik?
So I started immersing myself in Yiddish children's literature in 2012 or 2013, working on what would eventually become Honey on the Page. And I could see right away when I started reading these stories, these Labzik stories, that Chaver Paver really understood how to speak to children. He had developed this really sort of bouncy, jazzy idiom that had a lot of energy. It was a deeply American text. We have some Soviet examples of children's literature in Yiddish that we can compare it with very directly. And those texts are wonderful in their own way. But when we read work by other Yiddish writers with similar political inclinations alongside Chaver Paver, we can really see that this is just a very deeply American idiom. So that was the first thing that really drew me to him. And then the second thing that I appreciated was the psychological depth with which Chaver Paver invests Labzik. Labzik does not want to be abandoned, as he is in the first episode, the first chapter. And he does want to be useful. And he really has a lot of anxiety around the possibility of not being useful or not being appreciated or not being seen for who he is and the totality of what he can do in the world. So I thought that those were pretty compelling character elements, especially to be introduced in this kind of charming canine form.
It's such a great point, too. I mean, because even his name, which seems like in Yiddish or to Slavic sounding ears, is this cute dog name, because his name means like a jigsaw, like a certain type of saw. He uses that saw quality of himself in order to act as to liberate himself from bonds of various kinds. And so it's this kind of amazing shift of how we think, how he wants to be of use, how he wants to transform his dogginess into something that is of use to humanity. It's an incredible it's an incredible way of using children's icons of children's literature in that way. It's amazing. And I'm wondering though, how did you two come to work on this together? What was the way that you started working on it, and how did you meet up and do all of that?
So Jake was a celebrated figure on our campus already. you tell the beginning of it, Jake.
Well, so Miriam and I first met one another. This is kind of it's a funny, we both sat on a panel for an event that Theatre Emory gave. They were doing an entire festival around the works of the British playwright and actor Harold Pinter. And we were both on a panel about Pinter's sort of ambiguous Jewishness in his life and work, which I was totally unqualified to comment on. So I'm not sure why I was there, but I'm glad that I was, because what they had asked me to do was share an excerpt from a one-person play that I originally developed as part of my undergraduate thesis that uses the Ashkenazi folklore, the comic stories of the fools of Chelm, as a lens to talk about Holocaust memory. That was the show, and they had me perform an excerpt from it, and Miriam enjoyed it, and it led to some conversations between us. And so for the years following, almost every year it seemed, when folktale and Chelm stories came up in her classes about Yiddish children's literature, Miriam would have me come and do a reading of my play, which was a whole lot of fun. And that was kind of the extent of our relationship for a while, until I took this extraordinary seminar that kind of changed my entire life, introducing me to the world of modern Yiddish literature.
And Jake had really been Yiddish adjacent. Sometimes you come across people that it would be so much better for them and for the world if they would just learn Yiddish already. Jake was one of those people. So I gave a little push, but it didn't take a lot of pushing.
Right, yeah, I was primed.
So the seminar that you joined was what was the seminar exactly again?
So
go ahead.
Yeah, in 2018, 2019, I had a fellowship at the Fox Center, our humanities center, that came with a condition. And the condition was that when you return to civilian life and to teaching, you need to either convene a semester-long seminar on campus for faculty and graduate students, or to give a shorter series of public talks. And I thought, all right, I'm going with the public option because I have 3 kids and I'm trying to research and teach. And so anything that's shorter is better. But it turned out to be wonderful because Jake came.
It was, I believe, 3 sessions over the course of 3 months. And, the topic was Miriam's research, Yiddish children's literature, but to even begin to have that conversation, you have to learn about what does it mean to say modern Yiddish literature, and how does something like that come into existence? And so I was initially just fascinated by that kind of cultural history, because Yiddish literature, in many ways, is very distinct from other national literatures, right? Like the sort of Enlightenment ideals that lead to those types of fictional writing show up very late in Yiddish land and then get cut off very early. And so my mind was just blown every 10 minutes during the seminar. I think Miriam saw me my eyes ablaze and feverishly taking notes. And then one consequential evening, we were walking back to our cars in the parking lot, and Miriam kind of leaned over and was like, I noticed you were really getting excited about those LABZIK stories. And I said, yeah, of course, they were incredible. And Miriam knew that I'd been working for about 5 years then as a professional puppeteer, and she said, wouldn't they make a great puppet show? And I, to my kind of shame, in retrospect, I was like, yes, of course. And in my mind, I was like, who is going to produce this Yiddish communist dog puppet show? Maybe one day, but I kind of put it on the back burner. But that really only lasted, a couple of weeks, because very soon after, Miriam was encouraging me further to kind of get serious about Yiddish. And I'm so glad that she did, because it created this sort of domino effect that led us to collaborating so closely on this production.
It's amazing. It's such a great combination of forces. One thing that I think that everyone can see when watching this production is that's so striking is how so many of the themes that appear in the original, in Chaver Paver's original stories that you selected here, that he originally was aiming at children, are so relevant today. I mean, since the original, foremost struggle of the IWO in its heyday was what they called anti-race hatred, which I guess we today call anti-racism. Race in the original LABZIK stories has a kind of a significant part, and it runs as an undercurrent. I'm wondering, what are the main issues that jumped out at you that you wanted to take on that you felt like were relevant today, and what maybe were some of the ones that you chose to leave out?
Sure. I mean, there is an abundance, unfortunately, of political and social topics that have lost none of their relevance in the time since Chaver Paver published this book in 1935. I mean, it's, barring the internet and global climate change, basically every other headline-worthy issue that we deal with today is present to some extent in this book. There's labor struggle and income inequality and crooked politicians and racism and police brutality and you name it, it's all there. And so we kind of had quite a lot to choose from, at least from the angle of which of these stories would be most relevant to a contemporary audience. And you brought up the racial element, which the story that focuses most on that we weren't able to include, but is, I think, kind of remarkably advanced for its time, because Labzik is, I wouldn't say the bad guy, but the way that this story about what they call weißer chauvinism is told is through Labzik recognizing his own racial bias, right? Labzik bites Noah, or Noach, one of the friends of Mulek, the boy that he lives with. And we'll talk a little bit more about Noah later, because he's very prominent in the last story in the film. But Labzik bites Noah, and as he says, because he looked different from the other boys who would come around the house. And it is through Labzik's ignorance and the response of all of the children in the neighborhood who very quickly mobilize to inform him what you've done is wrong, and we are going to come up with an appropriate way to punish you for it. In this case was, I believe, social ostracization for a set period of time. But I think that is so remarkable that it wasn't, he wasn't painting the racist as being some like external figure that couldn't possibly be, implicating our community. It was like, no, actually our beloved protagonist himself has fallen victim to this, because it is, as we now understand, pervasive in, every facet of our society. But to locate that impulse in Labzik, whom we all love, and see not only can he have this, take this awful action because of his ignorance or because of his biases, but then learn from it and recognize it and change his behavior, like that feels like a very advanced way to tackle something, especially for children, especially in 1935. I just thought that was just absolutely extraordinary from Chaver Paver. Yeah.
And were there, aside from leaving out that incident where Labzik has to sort of unlearn his inherent biases, were there other aspects that you felt like you might have left out that you would have wanted to have included? And if you had a like unlimited length production, what you would have wanted, the kind of the big issues that you might have wanted to tackle that crop up in Labzik?
Well, Miriam, maybe you want to talk. I know what we had been thinking about. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, sure. There are some others, and we tried to pull episodes that would bring together themes that might be represented elsewhere. But if I had the unlimited Netflix budget to make, the full 12 episodes to go with the 12 in the book, I think I also would have included this really delightful episode with a kind of a dark side, which is when Labzik makes friends with this rich doggy who lives in a house on the other side of the park. And they come together in the park in this kind of neutral public space, and they do all the things that doggies do. They sniff each other, they play, they chase, they roll around. And at one point, Labzik's friend comes to visit, and her owner, who's a very bourgeois proper lady, comes and kind of invades the family home in order to retrieve her pooch. And it is funny and adorable, and it would be so given to puppetry, but it does have this kind of dark side, because the message that we're getting from most of the stories in the book is that remediation is possible, and the people that you think are distant from you can really be mobilized to the same cause, and you can be in solidarity with them. But there are a few people who are beyond the ken, and they're not going to enter the alliance with you, and there's really nothing to do but cut off ties with them, or to just kind of, lose touch with them. And even in the Yiddish-speaking Bronx, on two different sides of the park, that divide might be present, so that this fledgling friendship that Labzik is enjoying really gets conclusively interrupted.
Yeah, there's another kind of, I think, issue that there are friendships that are also sort of, the possibilities are foreclosed. Again, and in this production, there's a little bit of a reference to it, which are the competition between Boy Scouts and pioneers. That the Boy Scouts are representative of militarist right-wing kind of authority, and are really kind of, they're the foil for everything that's good about the pioneers. And they come up, I think, a little bit in your production, but there's this way that there's both, I think we see it in your production, but also, of course, in the stories, that the goal of these books, or the stories, is to mobilize youth to become activists, and to mobilize them also to liberate themselves from the dominant ideology of things like the Boy Scouts, which are seen as absolute enemies. And I'm wondering, like, that's an interesting thing, I think, to look at just as a phenomenon of literature, of this particular literature, of children's literature. And I'm wondering, Miriam, about the role of children's literature in Yiddish, perhaps how it was different in the Soviet Union or in the United States to inspire youth to become activists. I think in the Soviet Union, it's a very different case, where kids grow up and they're kind of put into the young pioneers, and they move up the ranks from Komsomol and move their way up. Here we have a real serious alternative in the Boy Scouts, which is clearly a threat to the young pioneers. And I'm wondering, how does literature, how does it play a role in that kind of activist motivation?
Sure. So Yiddish children turns out to be even the Yiddish children's literature, just of the left, just of the secularist left, turns out to be a many-splendored thing. And it's really multifarious. But if I had to choose one theme or one set of concerns that we see portrayed most often and across the widest swath of that literature, it would be income inequality, the fact that some people have wealth and others live in poverty. And everybody agrees that this is a situation that needs to be remediated. So in some of that literature, the remediation takes a very traditional form of the obligation to give charity, of tzedakah. And that is a theme that's pushed in work by Tzina Rabinovich, by Sholem Ash. But there's also literature that says, no, actually, the solution to this is collective action toward the redistribution of wealth. And some stories go into the mechanics of how you engage in that collective action, peaceful protests of various kinds. So we get a delightful story about when the birds went on strike because of their brethren who were being kept in cages in the city. And they realized that if they stop singing, then there's nobody to wake up the sun won't rise, nobody can go about their normal activities without the bird song. So getting the humble worker to recognize the power that they hold and to mobilize that power. Other stories are less concerned with the mechanics, and they're more interested in the underlying realization of the arrival at class consciousness, the realization of what a child's role is in the economic order, particularly if they are living in circumstances of relative security and privilege.
Jake, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your process of selection for adaptation here. You know, when you had all the stories and Miriam has translated the whole collection of these stories, and you had all these stories both in Yiddish and in translation in front of you, what drove you to choose certain stories and not others, and what allowed you to settle on these ones in particular?
Sure, yeah. So we already referenced probably the primary lens, which was how relevant thematically does it feel to our immediate moment, which only narrowed it down so much because it's also relevant. But, you know, it took out, for example, if we can only do so much, we're probably not going to include the one where Labzik gets in trouble for running to school and interrupting the singing of the Internationale with his howling because he wants to be a part of things. Now, I love that story, but maybe not as immediately relevant, right? And a few others along those lines. So we were looking towards the relevance. We were also looking towards, you know, puppetry is primarily a visual medium. So we were looking at the stories that had the most kinetic action that would translate best to what puppetry really does, you know, and so this is something that I said to Miriam early on, and this is something that one of my first puppet directors said to me, which is that the least interesting thing that a puppet can do is talk. That doesn't mean it's not interesting or that we don't want to see it. In fact, some of my favorite moments of what we've done here involve, you know, the combination of our fabulous voice actors and our brilliant designer Ryan Bradburn's constructions of these puppets, many of which have very incredible and unique speech mechanisms. But it meant that we didn't want to rely on just having talking heads, right? We wanted there to be action. So that was another substantial part of it. And then there was sort of the zoomed out, like, holistic perspective, I guess, which is how do we create a selection of these stories that feels balanced tonally and thematically, and through which that we can sort of chart an arc. You know, it seemed obvious from the beginning. Of course, we were going to include those Krisis Hinterle, the hard luck pup, the intro story where we first meet Labzik, see him abandoned and then reclaimed and taken home by Beryl the operator. You know, but we wanted to kind of see an energy that would ramp up and continuously and carry us through to the end, which I felt very strongly that we wanted to include this final story, Labzik and the Pioneers. And we were a little unsure at first because it is the longest story in the collection by a lot. It is 3 times as long as the stories in the first act of our film. So it is the entirety of Act 2. But it is so thrilling. There's so much suspense and so much action and a cavalcade of interesting and bizarre characters. And I think it also most manifests this phenomenon that is present throughout the books, which is the way in which, like you said, right, he was interested in kind of mobilizing his young readers to themselves be involved politically. And over again, they are taught through these stories, one of the hurdles to that action will be the adult world. There will be grown-ups who have not only different, but in fact, contradictory values to yours, and you will have to overcome them. And so, you know, in this final story, we see that made so very clear in the person of the principal, who is himself an authority figure, but also we see him mobilizing all of the various forces of the adult world in defense of the status quo that the Labzik and our other young heroes have to overcome.
Yeah, and also the inability to know whom to trust in a certain sense. They're all the kids are dubious of Miss Crane, who Chaver Paver is at pains to tell us is in solidarity with the kids, but cannot speak out for fear of being labeled a red. And that's an incredible thing to be teaching the kids, I think, as a didactic work, to have this piece of literature that says your teacher is also a worker, and your teacher may also be on your side, but cannot show her support. And that's this incredible break between Miss Crane, the principal, in your production, also the principal's mustache, who I believe plays a role in and of itself. And then also the kids in the classroom. I think that's one of these incredible moments of showing how solidarity can work, how there are fellow travelers, maybe there are people who can't.
And Shane Baker is terrifying as the principal. I mean, absolutely terrifying. And I think that the one place where I look at this text and say, he wasn't so far ahead of his time, actually, has to do with gender and gender stereotypes and the power differential between the principal, who of course is male, and the classroom teacher, who is female and who is very much in fear for her job and her livelihood. That's also really potent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting. The gender divide is very specific throughout the book. And of course it shows here about the way that labor has been divided up, and the way that also different forms of solidarity can operate between who's doing what. The way that families in the book will come together to be a part of a strike. And that happens multiple times as a kind of a running motif or a coda throughout the book, where there are these strikes and the mothers and the families all join forces up with the people who are most in need of action because of the strike. I think that's an incredible observation about the book. And it's something that I think that's one of the striking moments of divide, I think, between the times we live in now and seeing this period especially represented is the way that gender plays such a particular part in the way that these struggles are playing out here. Yeah. So speaking of that, the principal, let's, I wonder actually if we could potentially look at a little bit of the scene with the principal, and maybe you could, Jake, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your process and walk us through how you did what you did here, and what your thoughts were when you were bringing this all to life. So let's take a look at that, and you talk us through it, and then we'll talk about it some more on the other side.
Sure.
When the principal realized that the children had outsmarted him.
You know, as we began, you know, what started was simply the adaptation process, creating these scripts. And very quickly, our designer Ryan created these incredible storyboards where we would first encounter imagery like this principal with his huge mustaches and the concepts for the different characters. And it was a remarkably quick process, the actual doing of it. We had 10 days in the studio, 189 puppets. And so we had to work very, very quickly, very efficiently, which is challenging with something like this because you're experimenting on the fly with these puppets and seeing how they interact with one another, with the backgrounds, with the lighting that our incredible videographer Milton Cordero is putting into place. This is one of my favorite moments in the entire book, when the mamas come in. And in a moment we'll hear one of their most incredible lines voiced by Miriam. And this is maybe the most, intense single moment in the entire thing, where this police officer is directly threatening to strike young Noah. And the mamas step in place, right? And collectively threaten him, and off he runs in fear, to appeal to his authority figure. I'm having fun just watching it. That principal, those incredible vances, his mustache, was, like so many of the extraordinary visual elements, totally an invention of Ryan Bradburn, our designer and illustrator and puppet fabricator. And so many of these, when we're working in a style of puppetry like this, where the camera is very close and the puppets are very small, a lot of the pleasure is in actually seeing things move and seeing little bits of the mechanisms and how it all comes together. And, these brilliant little things like him having no mouth at all, but just a set of mustaches that synchronized to his speech. Just as soon as I saw the puppet, I was like, please, let me grab a hold of this and let's start playing around, because a lot of the fun of this process would be, we would all come together with our different experiences and perspective. Ryan would hand me one of those puppets and we would just start playing, and I would, apply my performance experience to these incredible visual and mechanical things that he put together. And, you know, together in the room, the four of us, me, Ryan, Milton, who was filming, editing, and then his wife, Sharon Estela, our brilliant stage and project manager, would really kind of operate as a collective. And I would get up there and start playing, and we would just see what happened. And, you know, because of that, moments came to be that none of us would have ever come up with working on our own.
There are so many incredible moments of detail, especially the visual detail, that are just amazing. I mean, some of the ones that I have not stopped thinking about since watching it, and I've watched it now a couple times. When you had Mulik trembling, for example, that's such it conveys so much, and that just that small gesture, just the movement of that puppet trembling, it's so striking. And then of course the mustaches, I think, are this incredible where they take on these roles, and people are certainly commenting online about the mustaches. But yeah, such an incredible piece of work with that visual attention to the visual detail and the movement and the gesture of these puppets. And it's so much, there's so much that's conveyed in these very small movements that are just beautiful. I'd like to talk a little bit about the movement of language here between Yiddish and English and then back into Yiddish. So Miriam, I'm interested in how, so your translation is this initial point of entry for Jake into this work, and then it comes back into Yiddish here. There's the way that the Yiddish now operates as the language of the dialogue. The narration happens in English or YEnglish. I'm wondering, what did you feel like was important to see conveyed in both in the translated aspects of it or perhaps in the Yiddish in the adaptation?
Well, Jake really wrote the adaptation. So, you know, anything that's specific to the adaptation, we worked on it very consultatively, but he drafted it. So I really love this idea that Jake came up with to keep the dialogue in Yiddish and to use the translation for all of the narrative. One of the things that I loved about it was that also enabled us to work with student actors from Emory. We ran a course alongside the production of the show this semester on Yiddish political theater. And we used the course as kind of a laboratory, and we ended up with all 4 episodes narrated by students, 3 of them enrolled in that class. What I really wanted to bring across was something of that idiom from the 30s. So I did not necessarily spend a lot of time looking up when a certain phrase entered American English, but occasionally I did. And there are a few phrases that definitely have the feel of the speech of a different time. And that was very much something that I sought out. And then I think that Jake found ways of bridging between that and really contemporary idiom. So maybe I should throw it over to you to talk a little bit about the introduction of a second narratorial layer.
Sure. We're talking about Chaver Paver, who appears as a sort of yet another degree of sort of a meta narrator above the narration, which itself is mostly sort of objective and removed. But yeah, early on, I kind of realized I wanted to introduce Chaver Paver as a character at first for sort of utilitarian purposes, which is like, this is a very specific cultural artifact that we're going to be introducing to people, many of whom maybe have no familiarity with this milieu. So having Chaver Paver there to be able to sort of introduce the work and speak for himself was sort of a practical choice at first. But then the more time I spent with him, the more interested I became in what it could kind of do for the work to have him there, this sort of interlocutor. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned YEnglish. He speaks in a sort of YEnglish peppered with Yiddishisms. And I mean, essentially, it's kind of a trilingual work in that way. And what Chaver Paver in part is doing is speaking in the closest thing to Yiddish that I myself had any familiarity with before I actually began to study the language. And I think this is true for a probably a lot of American Jews who maybe had a parent or grandparent or great-grandparents who spoke Yiddish, maybe around them or maybe not, but have otherwise had, this whatever post-vernacular relationship with it, where Yiddish has been a signifier of something, or a secret language between grandparents, or a reference to a world gone by. And that's kind of all I had access to. I did not have the good fortune of, being educated in one of the, handful of remaining descendants of the Yiddish shulas that he was developing work for. I had a very sort of middle of the road American Jewish, modern Orthodox institutional schooling. And so Yiddish for me existed in the way that it exists here with Chaver Paver, where it floats around the margins and it peppers his speech. And, I had teachers and adults in my life who spoke that way. And I was, voracious for like comedy when I was younger. And so, I was, as a 12-year-old, seeing these like videos of these old and audios of these old Borscht Belt comedians and like Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and stuff, and so that was kind of my way in, was this language that I can recognize now as like a kind of odd little stepchild of the Yiddish American experience, but it really, I think there maybe is some exciting and interesting critical things that we could say about the way the languages are functioning. But for me, it was kind of plain and simple, just that I adored the fabulous writing of Chaver Paver, and I adored the fabulous writing and translation of Miriam Udel. And I wanted to make sure that we could bring both of those to life for our audience. And kind of only after the fact did the dynamics and the interplay between those things sort of arise and become a phenomenon of their own.
It's interesting to watch and listen and hear you describe it, because one of the things that I was struck by, I think, listening especially to it, was almost exactly what you're describing, but this idea that the meta narration, the Chaver Paver pieces that you perform here, really do feel like they transcend time in a certain sense, and they do reference this what Jeff Chandler might call this post-vernacular status of Yiddish, that it's filtered through your experience of the Yiddish past, whether that's the Borscht Belt or Alan Sherman or Mickey Katz or any of these kinds of hodgepodges or assemblages of Yiddish and English through a certain type of accented language. And one of the things that I'm often struck by when I'm teaching Yiddish classes is how younger generations of people coming to Yiddish don't have an actual auditory memory of a Yiddish sounding past. That idea is dissipating or has disappeared from many people's lives. And even the sound of like kind of an older Jewish Yiddish inflected language that used to be a part of advertising and television programs, the real one, it doesn't exist so much anymore for many people to hear. It's a new thing. And the people who come to Yiddish are often learning this Yivo, new academic Yiddish, or they're coming to it and they don't have the same kind of sense. So it was almost refreshing to hear this sort of your take on it, that it felt very both contemporary, but also like it was referencing something from the past, which I really enjoyed. And it also I think works well with what Miriam was just talking about, this idea of the English language idiom, and the register choices that you use in your translation, both in the publication of the translation, but also in this production, where you can hear that it's the language of children's literature of the early or middle of 20th century. And we know that language, we don't speak like that, but it's kind of an incredible, another kind of mashing together, another kind of pastiche that's happening that can only be a contemporary production. So it's a very interesting combination, I think, for the two of you. I'm wondering if that was something that you leaned into or honed during the process, or is that just something that just kind of formulated and that you see now when you look back on it?
I mean, I'd love to be very clever and say we planned all of it. And Miriam, maybe you were thinking about this more deeply, more actively than I was, but a lot of this is just kind of the good fortune of what happened when all of the ideas and elements we were playing with finally kind of smashed into one another. And you know, it's sort of a whole is greater than the sum of its parts things. A lot of the things that you're describing sound very smart to me, and I absolutely did not sort of articulate it so intentionally and clearly at the time. I don't know, Miriam, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, halavai, if only we had thought of all of these things. We needed Robbie as the like in-house critic. I feel like we were very much trying to, I think, you know, this whole piece of art that we've made now arose in pandemic times and was conditioned by pandemic modes of being and doing. So we were trying to survive first translation crisis to translation crisis. When I translate, I often will rack up a list of what I call the known unknowns, things that I know that I'm not sure about, that I might be getting wrong, and I need to speak to a native speaker or somebody even, you know, more deeply grounded in the language than I am. And I always worry about the unknown unknowns. And then once we actually went into production, just very much a sense of, you know, problem solving on the fly and kind of figuring things out and ricochet from challenge to another. So that's the honest truth.
So one of the things that came up just a little bit when you were talking, both of you were talking about this, was especially Jake, when you were talking about this kind of the capturing that sound or the feel of the Yiddish, or what that linked you back to in terms of the past. It's interesting because, especially from the perspective of working at a Yiddish culture organization and seeing the way that people turn to Yiddish as some sort of marker of something, whether that's something authentically Jewish, whatever that means, or some kind of, and that, I think it's interesting to hear you express it that way. The other thing that I was thinking about when listening to this production is sort of the auditory, the musical components that you use in the production. And it's interesting because I think that you use a lot of very incredible contemporary klezmorim and the use of klezmer itself throughout as sort of the audio, the bed of the production. And then there are ways, I think, also the way that sometimes Yiddish is called on today, there are ways that klezmer today has become this auditory sort of marker of Jewish, of something, of this authentic Jewish past. And it's interesting, I think, here, especially because I think that that might be a little bit at odds with the way that people in the Chaver Paver and the IWO circle may have thought of klezmer at the time in the 1930s and 40s. So I'm wondering about why you went the direction of choosing klezmorim and klezmer as the sort of auditory base of the production, and what that meant to you, and those choices that went into that process.
Very early on, once we realized things were truly going to production, Miriam introduced me to a Yiddishist and an ethnomusicologist named Zeke Levine, and the three of us met to talk about what the musical world of LABZIK might be, because I knew that it needed music. I knew it absolutely needed music. I think everything needs music, but these stories in particular. And you know, one of the really fascinating things about talking to someone who actually is an expert in this stuff was the conversation about, you know, this very nebulous idea of authenticity. And are we trying to represent something? Are we trying to gesture towards something? Like what is our actual intention? Because the reality is that these characters are not listening to klezmer music if they're listening to music, right? If they're listening to music on the radio, if they're singing it, it's probably Jewish folk song of some kind. It might be contemporary American music, more like some of the jazz stuff that we hear in the first story.
And we do have our lullaby. Ara Hetko composed a beautiful lullaby to sing to Labzik when he comes home to Bettel's family.
Right.
So
a more motif. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, you know, we asked her, because that is, you know, that is her area of expertise, and she's such a wonderful singer and musician to bring in that Yiddish folk song feeling there. But you know, it was a choice, because we could have gone, okay, we're going to go as authentic as possible, and it's all going to be folk music. But like, that's not what this is. This is like we're in the Bronx, you know, like these are very much urban stories. And so we spent a lot of time looking at the intersections of klezmer and jazz. and the ways in which they influenced one another in the US at the time. And, you know, things like looking at the Gershwins, who were born, I want to say Gershovitz or something like that. They weren't Gershwins, but the ways in which these, you know, Eastern European Jewish musical modes made their way into things that were becoming in the American mainstream. And so, you know, I never felt any commitment towards one particular authentic representation. And more so, you know, I think very early on, Miriam and I kind of felt that we could be liberated to pull on anything that was evocative of what we were interested in without having to go, well, they never would have been listening to this song or such and such, you know, which there's value in that. But I think there's something exciting about allowing all of these different elements, some of which were totally of the time, some of which are only of the time through our imagination in 2021, to coexist together, to lead one into another. So much of that is due to our extraordinary sound designer, Melanie Chen Cole. All of the music that wasn't performed by our klezmorim, Michael Winograd and Jake Schulman was all put together or composed or performed by Melanie, along with all of that wonderful soundscape, the trains, the rain, the subway car, the dog barks. And I just love what she did. It feels so immersive. It feels like you get dunked into maybe not actually Jackson Avenue in 1935, but some sort of incredible imagination space of that idea of that place and time.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible thing because it's filtered through your experience. I think that's one of the interesting, your contemporary experience. So if you're going to be looking back or listening back over, you know, 80, 85 years to what it may have sounded like, all of these other influences of what has happened since are going to become these dominant sounds of it. So post-klezmer revival, all these things that happened in the 70s and 80s and beyond. And you're looking back on this period of the Bronx from your perspective today in Atlanta in this century. And then all these sounds, you know, filter through that experience, even if it's not the sound of what, you know, Chaver Paver is referencing. My recollection, and maybe you correct me, I think that there's only a handful of references to music directly actually in the book. There's the Internationale, which you mentioned earlier, and there's another lullaby that's sung to the whimpering Labzik at the very beginning. But I can't recall other pieces that reference it as directly as your piece here does.
Yeah.
But speaking of lullabies and songs, before we take some questions from the audience, I think let's turn to one particular musical aspect of this production that I think deserves some extra attention. That's the Ode to Labzik that appears as the kind of entr'acte in the middle. And I'd love to ask you more about that. And let's take a look at that and listen to that, and then we'll talk about it on the other side of the clip.
In the Bronx, in der Subway, Jackson Avenue Stanzie, sitzt dort dahinter schön und allein. Von sein Dieninken Hälsel hängt a kleine Quittanzie, wo es steht, das ist Labzik, nimm ihm a heim. Jetzt ist Labzik Tage bekannt, alle wissen, als ist a Brillant. Das kluge Hinterle Labzik, unser Freund, unser teurer Held, a Chaver, a Bruder, a Mann hier, einer auf der ganzen Welt. Von Arbeiters von alle Länder, von Fabriken und von jeden Ständer, schweren, dass das Hinterle Labzik hat gewure ohne Schier, hat Theorie und euch hat Praktik, steckt ein Schnuck in Revolutionsstil. Labzik steckt ein Schnuck in revolucjes
All right, so tell us a little bit about how this came about. This this Lied für Labzik, this ode to Labzik.
I'll try to be brief because I'm so in love with this, and I can say that because I think most of what makes it so great I owe to the other folks involved. But this started as a joke, mostly that I was telling myself. You know, I was working so much on this. Miriam and I were going back and forth working on the scripts, and so I needed something else to do when my brain was still in Labzik land, but I couldn't do any more script work. And I started playing along with this. I had heard last summer, Dan Kahn and Soy Korolenko came out with this album with a bunch of interesting, weird, old Yiddish, mostly Soviet and pre-Soviet songs. And one of them was a song called Dosnaya Rusland, which was another, like Lied für Labzik, a parody of the famous lullaby Rozinki's mit Mandlin. And that one was a sort of like anti-imperial revenge fantasy about Tsar Nikolai being trapped in the Winkel Cheder. But I was so into it, and I learned later that this is representative of kind of a broad trend and great tradition of song parody in Yiddish for a variety of reasons and a variety of contexts: political, comic, theatrical, whatever. And that is a idiom in which I am, some might say, too comfortable. You mentioned Alan Sherman, who I grew up with, Weird Al Yankovic, very important to me. And so I started playing with this, and slowly getting more excited by it. I showed it to Miriam. She thought it was interesting enough. We should maybe try and find a way to put it in. And then it was only when I started working with Michael Yashinsky, who sings the melody line, to punch it up, because I knew like what I wrote was cute, but like I'm an intermediate student of Yiddish at best. And Michael has so much experience in this area, and he really helped take the lyrics somewhere new. And at this point, it was just kind of this, the momentum of it was building, and I was getting more and more excited about this. And we kind of started shooting for the moon in terms of our dream collaborators. And once we were able to work with Michael Winograd and Jake Schulman-Ment, who did the beautiful instrumental, we were so fortunate to get Lisa Fishman, who also sings on it, and then Lauren Sklamberg from the Klezmatics sings those lovely little harmonies at the end. And I don't know, I think all shows should have at least one song. You know, less in the musical theater way, but more in the kind of like variety show way. And I don't know, it needed something to break up these acts. And I just think, you know, giving people an opportunity to kind of take a breath from the action of the stories, reflect a little bit with this kind of clip show on what had happened to them over the last 30 minutes. And yeah, showcase these amazing singers. I couldn't be more thrilled with how that turned out. And I feel so fortunate for the incredible team of folks who helped put it together.
No, it makes me feel like there should be a full-length Labzik musical that emerges from this that we should
we'll talk.
Yeah. And we have a question here. The characters' designs seem evocative of classic portrayals of uprising workers, bourgeois cops, mayors, and principals. What were some of your artistic inspirations?
Miriam and I talked a lot about Yossel Kotler and Zuni Maud, who collectively make up the single antecedent that we are aware of for a Yiddish puppet company. These were guys who are involved in left politics, in the Yiddish scene in New York at the same time. They met doing, you know, satirical political cartoons. They're both these very prolific illustrators, and they do this work that kind of bridges like old world Yiddishkayt tropes with very like modernist stuff. And so we were introducing them and talking about them in the course that we were teaching, and they did so much political work. So a lot of the stuff that they did, I passed along to Ryan, our designer, and said, you know, I'm not going to tell you how to do this, and your impulses are going to be the best thing, but I'd love if it could be informed by this. This is sort of our usable visual history here, and I love what he did with it because it is so his own fabulous style. But I agree that we can kind of hear the echoes of the long tradition of this kind of like proletarian illustration work.
Yeah, it's amazing to see too, because I think that there's a real break between that style, especially the style that appears in journals like the Kunde, Goise Kundis, or other kinds of leftist journals and their cartoon work and comic work. And then the way that Labzik has actually illustrated, or Vovik, for example, where you have a totally different style that feels more like 1930s children's books often, but lacks a little bit of the revolutionary aesthetic, I think. And it's interesting to see you turn to that here in this production. Before we go, we're just at the end of our time. I'm wondering from both of you what you hope to do with this material in the future, or for Miriam, if there's a work of Yiddish children's literature that you hope to be adapted and transformed into something amazing like this in the future, what would that be? And for Jake, what do you hope to work with? What Yiddish material are you turning to for inspiration next?
So we have so many aspirations for our Labzik and his Vovik. I have translated all 12 of the stories, and I'm working now on an introduction to those so that hopefully my agent can start shopping that around. I think it wants to be a graphic novel. And I think that, more of the stories want to be animated in some form, whether that's puppets or animation. And then I'm also at work on a critical study that is a companion to Honey on the Page about why we need to know all about Yiddish children's literature if we really want to understand Jewish modernity.
Fabulous. I mean, like Miriam said, she's translated all 12, and I would love to work with the 8 remaining stories. I've read all of those translations, and they're fantastic. There's so much there. I would love to work with that. We have some ambitions for this work. We're hoping, there's some complications with rights and stuff we're working through, but it seems like everything's gonna work out. We're hoping to possibly submit to some film festivals and that sort of thing. That's a bit still in the air. Otherwise, I'm not sure. I have a bit of an obsession with this Yossel Cutler book called Muntergang, which the Great Small Works company already, it wasn't an adaptation, but they did a really remarkable multifaceted puppet show about that. But you should talk to me at the end of the summer. I've just begun an intermediate intensive, and Yiddish is flooding into my brain at an extremely rapid pace. So call me at the end of July, and we'll see what's on the docket.
Sounds good. We have one last question that I'm going to throw at you, which is just someone asked here. Gladys asked, how long did it take in total to create this film? How many people had worked on it? If you want to answer that.
I don't know if I could put an hour on it. I can say that we started pitching the concept last July. I think Miriam and I started working in earnest on it near the end of the summer. There were months of adaptation and storyboarding, and then the actual physical work happened very, very quickly. Those 189 puppets that Ryan designed and built were made in a remarkably short amount of the time. We had only 10 days to film, and Milton, our fabulous videographer and video director, only had 10 days to edit it. So it moved at a very rapid pace, but all of it was made possible to do it in that way and to do it to such a degree of high production because of the extraordinary, incredible team of artists that we had on this, many of whom neither Miriam and I had ever met or worked with before. So we really got fortunate that these amazing, amazing people lent us their time and talents to work together. No,
it's a fantastic production altogether, and it came out just beautifully. And it looks like we've run out of time for our discussion. And for those of you who haven't yet seen this production of Labzik, please check out our links to take a look. And thanks, as always, to our team behind the scenes, Lisa Kenner-Grissom and Claire Fester, and everyone at Theater Emory for this incredible production. And from all of us at Yiddishkayt, have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Seid gesund.
Seid ihr alle gesund.